Son sets free, who is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last, He has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, He died for me. Who the Son sets free, who is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who You say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who You say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who You say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who You say I am. I am who You say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my
Right. Good morning, everyone. Is that working okay? I did print out a few more sheets. It looks like they might have gotten taken. They were on the back table there. So if you need one, we can try to get somebody to make a copy for you again. Does that sound a little loud? It sounds loud to me. Is everybody okay? Be honest. No one's paying attention. All right, good. All right, where we are. Okay. So, we are this morning going to begin our study of eschatology moving into the book of Revelation. So, I assume we'll probably be here for a couple weeks. My goal is 2. And then we will move to kingdom issues like what's next. So if you remember, we're kind of working our way through a timeline. We've done the rapture, and we've done the beginning of the tribulation, and now we're working through some other passages on the tribulation. And the next event, other than some of the kind of transitional events, battles and things like that, and a little thing like the second coming of Jesus, the next big, long event is the millennial kingdom, and so we'll be moving to that, transitioning over to that in the next couple of weeks as well. So I want to start out with a word of prayer, and then we will get working on this passage. Lord, I thank you so much for bringing us together today and just the chance to worship you, and through the songs, even through the video of the Voice of the Martyrs, Lord, and we just thank you so much for the awareness that we can have of that, so we can be praying and giving and thinking about that. And finding ways that we can support others, kind of growing our view of the church, and not just thinking it's a Jenison, Granville, Michigan thing, but a world thing, Lord. And so just help us as we grow and get to know you better, even through our study this morning, Lord, in your name. Amen. Is it still this afternoon? It is 12 if you missed your time change. So we are in Revelation. We're going to start around chapter 6, if you would turn in your Bible there. But as we're turning there, I do want to kind of just reflect on one kind of reminder that I want to do while we're working through this passage. If you remember a few weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the different ways to view eschatology or prophecy, especially these end times things. And if you remember, I said there were basically 4 views, and obviously there's modified views, but basically 4 views. The first view is called the preterist view, which says that these events in prophecy or eschatology happened already in the first century. So they described literal events, but those literal events already took place. They're over. And by the way, with that view, if you take a late writing of the book of Revelation, somewhere around the time of 95 AD, then you would say this isn't really prophecy. It might even be more historical, because the major event in that first century was the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So it was destroyed a good 20 to 30 years prior to John writing his apocalypse, his book of Revelation. So that's a little interesting note. Now, some people actually will say that John wrote that earlier, like 60 to 65 AD, just to keep the prophetic nature of it intact. So that was called the preterist view. The second view is called the historicist view. And the historicist view has a very prophetic but also very allegorical nature, in that it basically takes the end time events and it says that they describe specifically Christian or historical eras. Now, keep with me here, that were in the future of the writer. Okay, not our future, but the future of the writer. So if John wrote it around 100 AD 100, then he's describing eras of the church to the end times, to the final day, if you would, the last things. And so you can think of, I want to keep this fresh in our mind, you can think of events that have happened in history. As you read some of these passages, you might think of some events that have happened in history or even church history and said, oh, this sounds like fill in the blank, the Black Plague, the Crusades, the World War II, the Holocaust, Napoleon. You can name different things and say, this sounds like this. And so that's kind of what happened when the historicist view is they started to look at these, and again, it's much more allegorical. Instead of, it's more era specific than like literal event specific, okay? That's called historicist view. The third view is either called the idealist view or sometimes just called the allegorical view. And basically the idealist says that this is just telling us like truth, fundamental truths about Christianity. And so, for example, if it talks about war, that there is war in the Christian life. Like we are battling against Satan. Ephesians, it's not against flesh and blood. Those kind of things. If there is temptation, if there's tribulation, of course there's tribulation. We just watched The Voice of the Martyrs, and that's been going on for 2,000 years. And so Revelation is describing this truth that is just a constant truth instead of specific events. It's more like, again, idealism. It's what's there. And it's kind of, an allegorical or figurative, or sometimes I've read the term spiritual interpretation, okay? And then the fourth and final view we would say that we hold here at Grace is called a futurist view. And so we would say most of these all the eschatological events, most of the events in the book of Revelation would be considered futuristic. They haven't happened yet, but they will happen at some point, and they will happen literally. We'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by that, even specifically here. So as we're working through these seals, these trumpets, these bowls, all these different pictures of eschatology, one kind of interesting thing to do is to think about what might this have represented. Because I always try to point out that even though we all think we're right about what we believe, right? Everybody just thinks we're right, you're wrong, okay? But those other people aren't stupid. They're not dumb. They have PhDs, and they've gone to school a long time, and they've read more books than I have. And so they have reasons to believe these things, and they have different things that they believe. And it's just kind of interesting to read through some of them. Some of them I've had as teachers because I didn't always go to a pre-tribulation rapture, premillennial type of school. And so they have their own viewpoints. And so I want to just look at some of those other things to see what might be going on in some of these passages. So if you are in Revelation chapter 6, and I think I have there up on the slide just kind of describing some of these facts about the book of Revelation. Basically chapter 6 to 19. I know I did a little bit of, probably a little bit of summary there, but basically 6 to 19 is considered the tribulation. So most people don't realize that most of the book of Revelation is actually telling about the 7-year tribulation. Again, just a reminder, that's the 70th week from the Daniel chapter 9 prophecy. And again, also most of what Jesus talks about in the Olivet Discourse, which we covered last week in Matthew 24. And then it's important to understand that the book of Revelation, which is called the Apocalypse of John, which is a Greek word that means to unveil, to reveal something. So I don't know if you maybe think of you have a Christmas present under your Christmas tree wrapped up and nobody knows what it is. And on the Christmas day, they open the present, they open the box, and what was in the box is revealed. It's unveiled for everybody to see. And that's what the word apocalypse, apocalypsis, or our English word revelation means. And so it's God is revealing, and specifically here it talks about Jesus, the Lamb, is revealing to John some future truth that was unknown, that people didn't know all this stuff. So he's kind of taking the sheet off of the future and saying, here's what's going to happen, John. And it's really interesting because you guys probably, even as I was just talking there, you recognize the word apocalypse as meaning, in our language today, it actually means like the end times, like the great battles at the end times. We have genres called apocalyptic literature today. For example, very famous, right, with Hunger Games and, teen books, and even zombie apocalypse and alien apocalypse. And, all these things is very popular today to use that terminology, apocalypse, but to understand that what it really meant was this kind of unveiling of the truth that was already there, that's there. The other thing to notice is that even though our Bible only has in the New Testament one apocalyptic genre, which is the book of Revelation, the Old Testament has some portions of apocalyptic literature. Zechariah is typically seen as the most apocalyptic. If you want to test that, go home and read Zechariah tonight, and then you'll say, yeah, I got it. That was pretty apocalyptic. It's a pretty strange book. And there's other sections as well, some in Ezekiel, some in Daniel, that would be considered apocalyptic, maybe some other chapters here and there. But it's important to understand the genre, because when you read a genre of literature, you kind of come to that genre with some, what would you call them? You understand some things that you don't have to think about, right? Like if you read a fiction book, and it starts talking about a person, you just know that that person's fiction. You're not going to go look them up or something and say, I'd really like to meet this guy. You just know they're fiction. You might read, for example, certain newspapers. Does anybody read the newspaper? You might read certain news stories a certain way because you have a bias for a news story, right? You might read a nonfiction book differently. You might read a mystery or historical fiction or things like that. You're going to read with some biases because, or even some preconceived ideas because you understand that genre of literature. Today, we don't really understand the apocalyptic literature nature of the kind of apocalyptic literature that was written 2,000 years ago. We understand apocalyptic literature today, but it's totally different than the apocalyptic literature that was written 2,000 years ago. This genre is not today at all, okay? And so, as you see up there on the notes, it says, in apocalyptic literature, there is figurative language. There is things, for example, in our book of Revelation, just that we're going to run into today and then the next week, seals, okay? And I always like to emphasize, a lot of you are picturing animals. Those are not the animal seals. It is the seals that are on maybe a scroll or a letter, and they would use a piece of wax, and they put the seal on it to number one, keep it safe, but also number two, to say who it was from. You would often have your own seal that would say you're king or whatever you are. So seals, what else did I put up there? Trumpets, bowls, those kind of things that can have a very figurative nature to them. Another thing that we see in apocalyptic literature a lot is numerology. And don't think of this as like, sometimes you might think of this, okay, that's like astrology or something like that. Numerology is just using numbers to mean something significant. And we know there is numerology in the Bible because the number 7 especially, it shows up everywhere, right? Even in our Daniel chapter 9, the 70 weeks of 7 years, Genesis 1, 7 days of creation. We see that number, and here we have 7 bowls, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, right? This number 7 is significant to God. The number 3 is significant to God, the Trinity. The number 12 is significant to God, and especially we'll see here in Revelation because it deals with the 12 tribes of Israel. And then I put, just as a kind of an extrapolation of that, the number 144,000, which shows up in Revelation, is 12 times 12,000. And so you see that significance again of the numbers that are used in apocalyptic literature. If you're interested in reading some other apocalyptic literature, there is a wealth of it. There's tons of it in the non-canonical form. So that means it's not in the Bible, but it was written between the Testaments. And we often call that those that are Christian apocalyptic or Jewish apocalyptic, we'd call pseudepigrapha or something like that. For example, there's a famous set of books called the Books of Enoch, which are apocalyptic. And so you can read that just to understand what is apocalyptic literature like. You wouldn't read it like you would the scriptures. You wouldn't read it like, okay, this is a message from God and I'm going to obey whatever it says. But you can read it to figure out what the genre of apocalyptic literature is like. The last thing I have up there is really important. Let me make sure I do. Yep. Even though the apocalyptic literature uses figurative language, numerology, other things that we typically don't think of when we interpret Scripture, what I really like to emphasize is that doesn't mean the things it's talking about aren't real. It uses these things to enhance or give us a picture or an understanding of a real, literal event, thing, person, place, whatever, that is going to happen in the future. And so that's why that's where we're really different between, okay, is this figurative thing telling us about idealism, or is this figurative thing telling us about an actual real event that's going to happen? And that's the difference. When I typically talk about the difference between literal and allegorical interpretation, that's what I would mean, okay? So understand that, and we'll look at some examples of that as we work our way through, at least my opinion of some of those examples. All right, any questions on that apocalyptic genre or anything else there about? Yes, ma'am.
I just think it's interesting when you say apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, it always comes with a sense of foreboding, of
Yeah.
doom, of darkness, of destruction. And I think that comes from that word being used to describe the tribulation. It is going to be a
Yes.
That says, oh, good, it's not going to be Christmas, but you're going to, unless you have a family that's really bad at giving gifts, you look forward to that. And ultimately, for us as believers, the end, the ultimate, is a joyous and happy and glorious time of so shall we ever be with the Lord.
Yeah.
Reigning with Him and being in glory and being united with Christ and being in the presence of God, of worshiping and all positive things. So it's not really the end, it's just the end of this time, end of this
Yeah.
end of this now. And I just think it's interesting that it's, like you said, if the word really doesn't carry those connotations with it, the word just means a revealing, but it's come to be pretty universally understood that the end of what's happening now is not going to be.
Pretty. Yeah. Yeah, so Kathy just said about basically that apocalyptic literature definitely has that kind of doom and gloom, and I as you're saying that, I'm thinking of like the Hunger Games, watching that series, and it's very gray. If you've watched that movie, it's very gray. Even the way people lived was very, unless you were living in that one city, everything was gloomy and gray. And even when you got to the end, I don't know if you watched it all the way through. I unfortunately did. And I got to the end and I just wasn't satisfied. Like I got to the end, I was like, it's still not good. It's still bad. And so one thing that you said that I want to make sure, this is a really good point to emphasize, is that one of the biggest differences between Christian apocalyptic literature is that it ends with God's victory over evil, sin, Satan, whatever that enemy is seen as. And that's totally, you're right, that's totally different. If you watch apocalyptic movies today, or you think even apocalyptic literature back then did not have that final ending like that. But it is true that we as humans, I use this in examples all the time, we really do think poorly of ourselves. We know we're bad. When we make up movies about what we would be like, it's always bad. When we say, hey, I wonder what it's going to be like in 100 years, it's horrible. Like, we know that we're bad people and that we do bad things when we're left to ourselves to do them. And so that's why I think the apocalyptic genre goes that way, is at least we know that one thing. And then in the Christian apocalyptic literature, obviously, I'm only right now doing Revelation 6 to 19, but of course there's the chapters after that where the story does turn good. God does win the battle, turn the tide, and we live in eternity with God. And it's not doom and gloom. It's not gray. It's not, oh man, is this really how I want to live eternity? It's, it's heaven. It's awesome. It's eternal. So it is a totally different picture of that. So thanks for sharing that. Yeah. When you go to the book of Revelation chapter 6, you start this series of events about these seals. And I want to just emphasize, you can read some of the context before when John sees these seals and this scroll that's sealed up with 7 seals. Okay, imagine that. How important this scroll must be if it has 7 seals on it. Like, right? It's like where do you have anything in your house that you lock? You put 7 locks on it to make sure that nobody's getting into that thing. That's how important this scroll is. John is like, oh, let's open the scroll, right? He's in heaven, and he's like, let's look at it. What's in the scroll? And they say, nobody can open the scroll. And John almost gets sad. He's like, oh, what are we going to do? No one can open the scroll. And all of a sudden, he sees the Lamb of God. And this, again, this picture here, this figurative language is obviously speaking about Jesus. And Jesus is the one who's able to open the seals to see what the scroll actually says. And so our story that we're going to look at today specifically starts in chapter 6, verse 1, where, and you'll see right there in verse 1, now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals. So, right, the Lamb is Jesus there, and Jesus has the scroll. This is what John sees. Remember, we talked a little bit about this last week. John is in heaven. He says he is in spirit. I don't really understand what that means. Like he's, maybe, what would he be describing? Like he's kind of floating there in heaven or something, and he sees this scroll, and all of a sudden, the Lamb, Jesus, starts to take one seal off at a time, and we're told what happens as each seal is removed. So in verse 2, it says, and I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow and a crown which was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Okay? So these are the traditional, if you ever heard this before and didn't know where it came from, these are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Okay, I have a sad story to tell you about myself. I grew up reading comic books, and I heard about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from comic books, never knowing that they were actually in the Bible in the first place, okay? And the X-Men, there were the 4 horsemen that were trying to defeat the X-Men. And all of a sudden, I go to Grace Bible College and read, wait a minute, these guys weren't created by Marvel. They were created by God. They're there already. So these are the traditional 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And by the way, these horsemen actually first show up in the book of Zechariah. So again, Revelation, by the way, will often feed off of, use some of the allusions and apocalypticness of the Old Testament apocalyptic literature, such as Daniel and Zechariah and Ezekiel and some of those passages. So again, if you want to read Zechariah, you'll read about these horsemen in Zechariah as well. So he watches it, and this first horseman is a conqueror, obviously, right? He comes out conquering and to conquer. He has a bow, a weapon, and a crown, which emphasizes him being some sort of king or emperor or something like that. He's on a white horse. I think that's significant. One of the things I think, when you read that first, if you think of somebody coming on a white horse, who might you suspect is riding a white horse? The good guy, right? And that's still today, right? Like, that's even in our old Western movies. It's the white horse and the black horse. The good guy's on the white horse. He's got the white hat. He's got the white. And so you might suspect that this first one is actually the Messiah coming back, right? And Messiah, if you remember, is the Greek word for Christ. So you might expect this is the Christ coming back. And I think that there's a reason for that, because we've talked about this mysterious figure that hasn't really been named that much. Back in Daniel, he was called the Prince, and Jesus only talked about false messiahs. But this is probably, at least most people believe, is the false Christ, or the word we often use is the Antichrist coming into the earth. Okay, so he comes, and an Antichrist is going to look like Christ, appear like Christ. You remember Jesus even said that some of these false Christs, false messiahs, false prophets are going to do miracles. Remember, he said that in Matthew 24? They're going to do miracles, they're going to do signs, and they're going to lead some people astray because it's going to seem like it's the Messiah, right? And so this guy's going to come in, he's going to conquer. I did read this one commentary, and maybe you guys can give me your input. I don't really think this. I guess I'd have to be persuaded. It says he has a bow. Do you see that there? He has a bow. If you have a bow, what good are you? You need an arrow. Thank you. I'm not smart enough to figure that out. I'm like, oh, a bow. All right, he's ready to go. No, a bow doesn't do anything, right? I guess you could hit somebody with a bow, but it's not the way a bow is supposed to be used. A bow needs arrows. And so I read some commentaries that thought what this was describing was a conquering that didn't have war. He conquered without war. He came in with might and power, but there was no actual war. I am a little I can't say that word. I'm a little doubtful of that. I'll just say that word instead. And I think there's still war going on, and you'll see it in these next 4. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of war that goes on. But to me, the war happens in that word conquering. Like when you conquer somebody, when you conquer things, and that's your whole purpose, it seems like there's going to be some war that takes place there. So just an interesting note, and again, one of those points where you understand that there's going to be 100 different interpretations, even futuristic views of this. There's going to be different ways to interpret that. Yeah, Jim?
Archers are also well known for standing well back from the battle and shooting
Good point.
from a distance rather than being engaged in the actual battle themselves.
Yeah, so he said that archers are well known for being kind of away from the battle, right? You want your archers in the back, and they're not actually in the battle, but they're also a major part of the battle, right? I mean, it's not like they're not in there at all, but they're just not in the hand-to-hand fighting. And so maybe this is emphasizing, again, just to take what you said, maybe it's emphasizing some kind of like behind-the-scenes manipulation of the conquest or something, yeah. Yeah, killing the king of the other side or something like that, yeah. I also just emphasize this idea of the white horse, again, being that Antichrist, but I just want to mention that I already said it. Again, apocalyptic literature, and you can disagree with me on this, I'm fine, but I don't need an actual guy on a horse, because most of us would say, okay, who's going to actually ride a horse today? Like, I don't see that happening very much. What I would say is, no, that's okay. It's figurative language, right? Who would be riding on the horse, on the white horse? It's the leader especially the white horse, right? The guy who's in charge, the guy who's the powerful guy. And again, this is the way John sees it. I don't necessarily need a guy to actually ride in on a white horse to win this battle. Again, I also want to emphasize that John is seeing something, and he might be describing things the way he sees them, but not have the vocabulary to say what it actually is. I mentioned that last week a little bit, right? He knows what a horse is, but does he know what I'm just throwing things out. Does he know what a tank is? Does he know what a car is? Does he know what an airplane is? He doesn't know any of these things, and so instead he knows what a horse is, and so he might say, here's a horse, okay? All right, so that's the first one, first horseman of the apocalypse. I call the horseman of conquest, okay? Some people have different names there for those 4 horsemen, but I call this guy of conquest. Number 2, verse 3, he says, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that the people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Okay, again, obviously right away you might recognize the red horse, which to me the first thing I thought of was blood, and certainly people are dying in this second horse. Now, that might again push that first one, the argument that people said that there wasn't actually bloodshed in that first one. It might make you say, oh yeah, because now there's the bloodshed here in the second one. Maybe the first one was some kind of peaceful takeover, but now obviously there is a lot of bloodshed that takes place. So the rider on a second horse, this time he is given a weapon of war that has no doubt is violent, right? A sword. You don't need anything else other than a sword to kill people with. He has been given power, notice, for people to slay one another. Okay, now you could take this 2 ways, I think. You could make this war, right? This could be wars going on, because that's obviously people slaying one another. But you might also read this, I wrote up there, I think, anarchy, right? Like where there's no law and people are allowed to kill one another without any judgment or risk of circumstance or whatever. Like if there is no real law out there, what's holding people from just going to their neighbor that they want their house, and they go over and kill them because they don't care, because no one's going to come back and get them. And so it might have a sense of anarchy as well as this sense of war that's going on in this second one. And so I call this one just the second seal there, the rider on a red horse, is just death or war or violence sometimes is what it's called too there as well. The red horse. Any questions on either of those first 2? I didn't say that on the first one. So on the first 2, the horse of conquering and the violence one. Okay, so the third one comes out. And the third one says, when he opened, verse 5, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine. Okay, this one is a little more mysterious, and you can almost sense that it's mysterious because not only does he see the horse, he now actually hears a voice that kind of explains what's going on. What he sees is a black horse, a rider on a black horse with a pair of scales in his hands. Okay, and again, this has to be explained to us because we don't really think about this very much, but in those days, if you went to a marketplace and you wanted to buy flour, you actually had those scales where they would weigh out a certain amount of flour, a certain amount of barley, a certain amount of wheat, a certain amount of whatever, and they had scales that they would measure to tell how much it cost. And early on, and even early on in the Bible, they talk about not having unfair scales, because what could you do if you wanted to raise the price? You just jimmy with the scale a little bit, right? And all of a sudden, oh man, that costs a lot more, and you owe me a lot more money. And the Bible actually talks about that in other passages. So there's something to do economic here, and then the voice makes it really clear that this is economic because he starts talking about a certain amount of flour, a certain amount of barley, costing a denarius, which is typically seen as a day's wage. So everybody, if you're retired, think about when you weren't retired. Think about how much money you made in one day. Okay, you don't have to do exact math. Just think about it. Okay, if you want to imagine $10 an hour and you worked an 8-hour day, and so you made $80, if that helps. Don't worry about how much the government takes away. That's not what we're worried about right now. So imagine you got $80 in your hand. And how much wheat does this buy? Well, typically they would say this is like how much wheat you could hold in your hand like this, right? So if they've got a bag of it and you put it in your hand, this is how much you get. Can you imagine spending $80 on that much? Or 3 of those of barley. By the way, barley is considered typically the cheaper of the herbs or the food there. Imagine spending $80. So what is this describing? What's happening? Why would that much wheat cost $80? We know this from our American government classes. What'd you say? Famine, and what'd you say? There's not much of it. What happens when there's not much of it? Higher demand, and we call that? Where's our economics teacher? When I was in 11th grade, I took economics. And when you have not much product and a lot of demand, all of a sudden the price goes up, and a loaf of bread might cost $10, where today maybe it costs $1 or $2 at the most, right? Or even worse, and it goes higher and higher and higher. So you have a problem of maybe not much product, but you also might have this problem of people holding it back or people not being able to produce it. By the way, one of the things that we want to talk about is it possible that all of these things are actually happening at the same time? Okay, and I'm going to blurt this out here because I actually have it in a slide in a second, so we will jump ahead just a teeny bit. But it's important here because is this like a chronological event, like here comes the first horse and he conquers, here comes the second horseman and he causes violence, but there's no more conquering. Now there's just violence. Now the violence is gone. Now we have whatever this third one is. And then he goes away, and then the fourth one. Or some people have suspected that all of these are together. They're not chronological as in 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Instead, they're 1, 2, 3, 4, all at the same time. And when you look at these 6, especially the first 6 seals, one of the major events that's going to happen is a cataclysmic event to the whole earth. If that happens, what would naturally happen to our production of fruits and vegetables and all that kind of stuff, even meat and that kind of stuff? It's all going to go down, right? I remember in Florida growing up, and we get that rare freeze, once every once in a while, and they're always like, oh, it's going to destroy our orange crop this year or whatever. I think we got like 3 orange crops because we have such a long season. But you're going to destroy that orange crop because we're going to get a freeze. Up here in Michigan, right, it's the apples or whatever. If there's some kind of cataclysmic event that happens, it can really devastate the local crop. Well, what if there's a world cataclysmic event? Right? That would devastate it all pretty drastically. And so just keep that in your mind. If these are all happening at the same time, they might help explain one another, right? Where are they supposed to get food if the food is being destroyed, the farms are being destroyed, the animals are being destroyed by all these other events that are going on? Where are they supposed to get food? The other problem is the last phrase, and do not harm the oil and the wine. Okay, and that one's caused a little bit of just questioning of what it means. Most people would certainly understand that the wheat and barley would be kind of the cheap stuff, and the wine and the oil would be considered kind of the high-end stuff. And so some have thought what this means is the famine, as Kathy mentioned, the famine is actually only going to be devastating on the poor of the world, and that's very natural, right? When there's a famine, who gets the food that's there? The people with stuff, right? The rich people, the military people, the presidents, the kings, they still have plenty of food. It's the poor people who suffer. And so maybe this is just describing that very natural tendency that when there is a low supply of that stuff, don't worry, the upper class, they get it. They're not worried about it, but it's the lower class that gets it. That's one idea that this passage has thought to mean. Others have said that maybe the oil and the wine doesn't get affected because of the type of crop they are or the type of cataclysmic event that it is. The oil and wine are the only things that are left. The other things are destroyed. So those are two ideas that people have thought there. In general, what it seems like this third horse, though, is that there is a famine that's caused by some kind of events that happen, whether it be a cataclysmic event. It could just be war. If number 2 is describing war, and everybody has to go to war, and there's war across the whole earth, what typically happens? The thing that's left out is the produce again, the production, right? You can't do that when you're afraid you're going to get shot every day that you walk outside of your house. And so that might be the reason that that's there for. So famine is typically thought of as that third horseman. Any thoughts on that one? I'm picturing my old Marvel comics, because he was like this, like you could see his ribs because he hadn't eaten in a long time. That was the third horseman. The fourth one, verse 7. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." Verse 8. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with famine, with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. Okay, so this one's there's a little more detail in this one, in that it actually gives us the name of the rider, and his name is Death, okay? He is on a pale horse, which typically most people think of that as like a sickly horse or something like that. And so he's representing some kind of sickness that's going to kill. Again, he says, 1/4 of the earth. And how does he do this? Well, multiple ways. With sword. Hey, remember? Horseman number 2 had a what? A sword. No, number 1 had the bow. Number 2 had the sword. Also by famine. What did we say horseman number 3 might represent? Famine, right? But that's not it. He also says with pestilence, okay, some kind of disease or something like that. And here's the weird one, and with wild beasts of the earth. Isn't that funny? I mean, not funny, but weird. Like, can you imagine, like, being afraid that we might get killed by wild beasts? I mean, that just doesn't seem to happen, at least to us where we live in our society. Like, to imagine that might be a day, again, where there might be predator animals walking around, and we don't have to just worry about a war going on. We have to worry about being hunted by a lion or some kind of predator animal that's going to get us. I did want to note, I was just doing this, I was looking up that word for wild beast, and there's a Greek word for it. I was looking at its other uses. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, he uses that term for Cretans. When Timothy is talking about, Titus, when Paul's talking to Titus in Titus chapter 1, I think if I said Timothy, I meant Titus. In Titus chapter 1, he's talking about the Cretans, and he calls them wild beasts. He uses the same word, therion, here in the Greek. He actually calls them, he has another word, kakos, which means evil or bad, wild beasts. I thought that was kind of funny. It might just be a slur on the people of Crete, but it made me think, okay, well, maybe that word therion might not actually mean wild beast in this case. Maybe it means like wild people. Like people that are wild beasts, that act like wild beasts. So just a thought, I would prefer the literal translation that there's literally wild beasts going around killing people too. But at least one example in the scriptures tells us that word can be used of us being wild beasts. People that are just out there living and killing people and they don't care about anything else type of a person. Okay, so a couple things to talk about here. Let me before I get into the next one. Death, obviously, we typically think of death, and by the way, death shows up again in Revelation near the end when death is gotten rid of. But then the word Hades there, who follows him, is the Greek word. It's the Greek god of death. So that's, again, I don't know if he's just kind of really trying to emphasize to these people, like, this is death coming in. And in Greek mythology, Hades isn't a bad guy. I know you all have watched Hercules and all those kind of movies. He's a bad guy. He's not a bad guy. He's just in charge of the underworld. That's his job. And so if a quarter of the earth dies, what does Hades get? He gets he's like, this is like payday for him. So he's just, coming in with a shovel just saying, here we go. I'm filling up the the registry down below is the way the Greek mythology would think about this. So just kind of understand that Hades there represents, it's where all these dead would be going at the end of the quarter of them dying. So let's look at just a side note. I think I have it up there. Oh, I didn't click it already. I'm sorry about that. Oh, yeah, this is it. Good. So a quarter of the world today, would be about 2 billion people. Okay, if you go on Google, you can search. I think there's 7 point something billion on the earth. So if we lost a quarter of the earth's population, and again, this doesn't even talk about time. I mean, how much time goes by? Does it happen instantly? I don't think so. It doesn't seem like it happens instantly. Is it happen over a month? Does it happen over a year? It's not very specific in the details of that, but it does say a quarter of the people die. If this is, even if you take it at the longest term it could be, which most people would say a year or maybe 2 years at the most, could you imagine the calamity on the earth if 2 billion people were to die in a 1 year period, a 6 month period or something like that? Can you imagine the devastation? Just to make you think real quick, like I remember a few years ago when that Ebola virus thing was a little bit, now we're like Ebola. But when the Ebola virus was a big deal, and if I remember correctly, the country that Ebola came from was this African country in the northwest part there, and so many people died in that country. They didn't know what to do with the bodies, and they were just piling the bodies up. And then what happened in that country because of that? Now you have dysentery. You have other diseases that come because you just have dead bodies sitting around and they start to rot, and now you get other diseases. And it becomes a devastating thing to people who you just can't handle the kind of death rates that are going on, right? So it just puts me a little bit in perspective. Again, it doesn't say 2 billion died of one specific thing. It says, war and wild animals and pestilence and famine, all these different things kill them. But 2 billion people dying in some certain amount of time would be awful, devastating. And that's today. Again, I'm fudging the numbers a little bit. It might be more like 1.7 or 1.8, but it's close to 2 billion people. At the growth of the earth, the way the earth is growing at this point, it will be 2 billion and not very long. We'll be at the 8 billion point pretty quickly. So this is where I asked that question, letter B there, is do these happen simultaneous, or are they describing this one event, are they describing one event that happened simultaneously, or are they describing one event, one event, one event, one event? I tend to think that these are describing all the same time. So the conqueror, number one, the violence, the war, the killing, number two, the famine, number three, all take part of that number four. Like he's collecting the deaths from all those other ones. They're the same way. Yeah. Yeah, the fifth one really adds to it, I think. Yeah, that's the big one. But maybe they go together. I'm going to throw up maybe a possibility there that they go together. So just that idea that maybe the fourth one is describing like, okay, the other three are causing all this chaos, and it's the culmination of all those other three, and that's the death that would happen. The pestilence, the famine, all these things. When death starts to happen, it will be almost like a snowball effect, that it's just going to keep more and more people are going to be dying because you just can't control it anymore. Worse things are going to happen. So why would there be wild animals? Well, I'm just going to throw out this one thing. I remember when I was a kid and I was maybe a freshman in college, and Hurricane Andrew went through Miami. If you guys remember that long ago, that was one of the bigger hurricanes that we've had, even still to today. And it went right through Miami, and I was living in about 3 hours north of Miami in Palm Bay, and I remember them saying that everybody's evacuating, but they didn't know what to do with the zoo animals. And so they opened the doors of all the zoo cages. They do this every once in a while whenever there's a terrible hurricane, because they want to give them a chance. Like, right, if you're a tiger and you're stuck in a cage and the place floods, what's going to happen to you? You're going to die. And so they open the cage, and everybody's gone, but now these wild animals, can you imagine being a tiger and all of a sudden your cage is open and you're like, what do I do now? You walk out and you're like, what's going to happen? Well, and then when the storm's over, then there's the process of the zookeepers finding the animals that they left out in the open. Well, I just imagine that, again, if this kind of chaos happens from these first four horsemen, that this might be one of the reasons that there's wild animals on the earth. That all of a sudden, like all these things that we kind of think of as, oh, I'm going to go to the zoo and watch the lion. Well, now all the lions are going to be out of their cages, and they're going to be looking for their next meal that they're not normally fed. So just the thought I had there on the wild beasts or the wild animals, you could obviously take that a little farther and think that, God actually enrages, like that's part of the judgment, is that God enrages the animals as well. All right, I want to finish at least this fifth seal here, and it will be gone. Sorry, I lost my verse. Verse 9. When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So the fifth one is kind of this kind of quiet thing, like those who have been martyred kind of say, okay, God, is this it? This has been a lot of bad stuff. Is this the judgment? And what does God say? Not yet. This isn't it yet. Which is pretty scary when you think about 2 billion people dying, right? Not yet. A few more people need to die before there's more judgment needs to be put out on the earth. And then finally, the last seal there, the sixth one, sorry, not the last one, but the sixth one, he says, when he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree shed its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. The kings of the earth and the great ones and generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Again, this is the cataclysmic event that I talked about a couple times already, and it's very similar to the Matthew 24 passage we read last week, right? It seems like the sun goes dark, the moon turns red this time, the sky closes like a scroll, all these things, a giant earthquake, all these things happen at once. Again, I want to emphasize, I might consider these seals all being the same thing. Again, if you think of the scroll and the seals being like all at the same time, like this is the first part of the judgment, that this is part of all these deaths. And it gets to the end of it, and I think it's interesting, who goes into the mountains to hide? Everybody, exactly. This is a non-discriminatory judgment. Everybody, kings, the rich, the poor, and everybody in between, because the judgment is so great that everybody goes to hide in the mountains. And again, I don't like being influenced by Hollywood, but I'm influenced by one of those apocalyptic movies I mentioned called Deep Impact. If anybody ever saw that one, it's about a meteor hitting the planet. And I think I'm saying the right one. I hope I am, because otherwise it's a different one. But they set up these caves in the mountains for people to go into, and they put rations and they put food in there. And when the meteor was going to hit the earth, they were going to hide people in that cave, have this gigantic door that shuts, and then once that door shut, nobody's coming in. And those people are going to live inside that cave for a while, because what's going to be out here is not going to be livable. And so they had this image that this giant cataclysmic event was going to happen. And I just thought it was, where did that guy, whoever wrote that, where did they get their idea? Well, the scriptures already give us that idea. Where's the only place to hide? Inside the mountain, inside the rock. That's the only place you'll be able to hide from all this judgment. And even when you're there, it's going to be so bad that you're going to wish that the rock would just fall on you, that the mountain would just fall on you. But God says, not yet. It's not over yet. So, all right. Again, I would probably argue under letter E that this is part of the destruction that happens by the fourth one, the quarter of the earth. But you could certainly say, no, this is just more. More people die through this. And so I'm okay with either way, however you want to say that. But there's definitely a cataclysmic event. What causes this event? What is this event? This is the end of our time. But think about what you might, if you were John, and you looked and you maybe try to think with a first turn of the first century AD mindset, what would make you say the sun went dark, the sky went, or the moon went red, the sky rolled up, the mountains and the islands were removed or moved from their place? What could cause that? What would you see that would make you say those words? And that's just our imagination. Again, I think there's a lot of ways we can interpret that. We can interpret that with our 21st century mindset of nuclear war, a meteor hitting the planet, other, maybe chemical disasters or environmental disasters, things like that could cause us to think those kind of things. Our mind probably has, we've seen enough or read enough or seen enough of these apocalyptic movies that we might come up with our own ideas. Again, I want to emphasize that it's the truth is that this will happen. How it happens is really for us just I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but it is going to happen. It will happen. What will it look like? What time, will it be now? Will it be hundreds of years from now? Will it be 1,000 years from now? I don't know, but it will happen. And it will happen as God says, as the Bible says. It is pointing to some literal event that will happen, and we just don't know how that's going to actually take place. So let's end our time with the seventh seal, which was 30 minutes of silence. Let's begin. Just kidding. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for bringing us together today and looking at the seals in the book of Revelation, and even all this discussion about eschatology can be confusing, scary, Lord, but just even as Kathy mentioned, the idea of apocalyptic literature is that you win, Lord, that you are the victor over death, over sin, over the pain and suffering, even the tribulation here on the earth, Lord, that you are the victor. And so we have great hope in that. We have excitedness about that as well, Lord, that we will be with you for eternity. We thank you for your scriptures that teach us all these things. Help us to know you better through them. In your name, amen. All right, come back next week for the trumpets and the bowls. Are they doing it in here? If you can stick around and help out, we're setting up this room for voting. So what did you want them to do? Just move them forward? Move some chairs, clear the floor. Yeah, we're going to they're going to use this room for voting. So if you want to just move our chairs to the side.